Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, June 8th, 2022. Today is Saturday, June 4th, 2022, and we are in the book of Ruth. We are in the second chapter. Let's start with verse 1. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live in a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." Let's pause here because we've actually slightly overrun but there's no good pause points in this story, really. Um, they're fixing to have a meal later, but set the scene. In the harvesting, the technology they had then, this was before iron tools were available to Israel. They would use sickles made of either brass or some of the poorer people might even still be using flint tools. They would grab a handful of the grain stalks and cut below them, grab another handful in that same and cut below, and do that. And they would gather these up into bundles, take a strand of the straw that the grain was on, and bind them into bundles, and that's a sheaf, and set it down. And when they, and the harvesters kept going like that, and they would cut the fields. Then they would pick up these bundles. In a wealthy farm like Boaz's, they would put them on a cart and then ship them, pull the cart full of sheaves to the winnowing place where they would beat the grain off, and the sheave would then be discarded. The grain would then be depends upon what kind of grain, but the chaff would be loosened from the grain by the appropriate technique, and then this would be pitched in the air. The wind would blow the chaff away, the covering off the outside, and the grain would then be collected. And that was the general process. But in the process of doing that, a lot of grain fell off. Now, it was not profitable for the farmer to send somebody out to go pick up the grain that fell off a sheaf or fell off the head when it was being harvested. They tried to harvest it before the grain got real loose, um, but they didn't want to do it so green that it didn't keep well and it was hard to uh, get off the head and hard to get the um, covering off the outside, the covering of the grain, the chaff. So it was a balancing act to get it just right. Modern farmers still do that today. Um, they have a little bit better techniques of harvesting that loses less, and our mechanical devices um, cause less waste, and they can pick it a little riper so it keeps better, and actually paradoxically it's more nutritious, and you know we have better techniques today, but they were pretty good techniques, and the grain would last um, generally about a year, sometime a little over, with the techniques they had. So they didn't have bad techniques, but up to 10% of the grain that grew could be lost to falling off the head or falling off the sheaf or falling off the wagon. And this fallen grain, it did several things. One, it attracted um, pests to the field, ones that would be interested in eating grain, whether that's grain weevils or rats or mice or things you don't want on your farm interfering with your crop and interfering with the storage. And but it was not profitable to go out and pick those grains up. So, farmers had an incentive besides just the financial incentive of losing crop um, to not want it there. On the other hand, they also lived in community with everybody in the community. It paid them to have as many people working as possible because the more people you have working, the faster you can get harvested, the faster you can get it um, threshed off the sheaves, off the uh, stalk, and then winnowed and stored. And so you want as many people employed as you can to get it done as fast as possible. And the whole community tended to be all in. And since a lot of the farms were family farms and family controlled, the clan, the larger family, generally backed them up. And the farmer and his family would be most of the laborers. He might have some hirelings that he hired, but at critical times in like harvest, when everybody needed to be in, they would, extend to the greater, larger family and go, hey, can you come help me this week while we harvest? Um, you know, and so even people that lived in town might come out to the farm and help their relatives and be paid for it. And the idea is the community needed everybody working. Because let's face it, the farmers cooperated together. They were generally relatives living near each other. But if this farmer's field was right, this farmer's field next to it would also be right. So everybody needed to labor at the same time. And, even the town drunk could get hired that week. He might not be a whole lot of good, but, somebody's got to haul water from the well to keep everybody hydrated. Somebody's got to haul the wagon to the threshing floor, et cetera, et cetera. Um, you know, and somebody's got to throw the grain up in the air to winnow it. I mean, there's all kinds of roles that even people that don't have net skill at farming could do and be productive. And farmers tended to hire anybody available, day laborers, everybody. Well, the very poorest of the poor then, they could get a job if they were fit to work. Now, what if somebody was not fit to work or wasn't connected enough to get a job with some relative? And Ruth the Moabitess was one of these. Or they were too frail, and like Naomi the widow could be, um, to do that. Well, then they also had a social welfare system where if you were willing to go out in the field and you were honest in your work and you didn't, steal from the sheaves or something like that, um, you could go out and pick up this fallen grain off the ground. There's stubble of the grain fields out there, and you went out and picked up what had fallen. It wasn't economical for the farmer to pick it up, but on the other hand, it was grain and it helped clean the field. It kept pests from being attracted to the field. Um, and it fed the very poorest of the poor people. It benefited everybody. Uh, and yes, it was work. Let's face it, stooping over and picking up individual grains of a grain off the ground is not easy work. And if you're going to get, a year's worth of grain during the harvest season for a person or two people, like Ruth was going to do, that was a lot of work, a lot of stooping, a lot of picking it up and putting it in the bag, in a container. Um, and it was allowed. This was part of the social welfare system. Uh, the community allowed those who were the very poorest, unfit for work, but still, and that didn't have a social network to support them otherwise. And the beggars and whatever could come out in the field and work between the sheaves and after even the sheaves had been picked up, and pick up any grain that had fallen, and it was theirs to keep. And the farmer wouldn't winnow it for them, but had essentially been already beat off the stalks, threshed, so you could take it home and winnow it yourself, and then store it. Somebody who's hardworking could actually glean enough grain to have a year's worth of grain for them and their families. It was not as easy as being the harvester, but the harvesters could easily get, enough grain for 20 or 30 people, even with the technology of that day. It would have been hard work, probably as physically demanding as gleaning among the sheaves was. But on the other hand, it was they had the tools, and it took knowledge and skill and experience and to do a good job, and a coordinated effort. There might be 25 harvesters, about 3 or 4 people picking up the sheaves, 2 or 3 that were threshing, and 2 that were winnowing, and then somebody else taking the winnowed grain and storing it. And with that many people, you'd have, 5 or 6 that were fixing food and water for everybody. You'd have to have, several overseers over each group, and somebody over the overseers. And so, this is a big operation. And Boaz apparently was an older man, a very wealthy man. He had hired this field. This was not his only field. he was coming, checking each of his fields and each of his work groups. And so he was checking in with his workers and making sure they were doing the job and checking in with the foreman. He was blessing them. Um, he was obviously an observant man, observed the rituals. He worshipped Yahweh. Um, and so he was out there checking on things, doing his job as the owner, and making sure that the foreman was doing his job and all the overseers were doing their jobs, and you know, being an experienced farmer, um, it he could just walk by the field and look and see it was being done, and he could also tell whether they had been working hard all day or that somebody gave him warning. Hey, Boaz is showing up. It's time to get back to work. You know, he knew where they should be in that field by that time of day. And if they were roughly there, he knew they'd been working hard all day. And if they were behind or if they were ahead, and what. And by the way, getting ahead was also a bad idea because that meant they were being careless and probably losing more grain that the gleaners would get. And so when he comes out there and observes, he sees somebody that he does not expect. I mean, he knows everybody in town. He's a well-connected person. Everybody knows him. He's greeting his workers, both the long-term workers for the farm and the temporary workers he's hired. He knows who they are. Probably everybody's from his clan or a near neighbor. And there's this stranger out there gleaning. And so he asks about her, and the foreman tells him, hey, this is Ruth, the Moabite. So actually, the foreman doesn't even know his name, or didn't state it. This is the Moabites that came with Naomi. And now, Boaz has heard the gossip in town. Let's face it, a wealthy man, he has time to listen to a lot of the gossip. And he knows that Ruth, the Moabitess, has come and followed Naomi back to town. Has probably heard indirectly or directly from Naomi about Ruth's statement that we read last chapter about how she's not going to abandon Naomi. She's going to live where she lives, worship her God, be part of her people, die where she dies. That beautiful statement. He's probably heard this already. And he has heard from his servants that have interacted with Naomi and watched what's going on, how Ruth is helping her mother-in-law and being there with her mother-in-law and being, a proper daughter-in-law and serving her and making sure her needs are met and how she loves her. And she's not just riding the coattails and acting, like I'm entitled. He's hearing that Ruth is doing what she should be doing, and is a servant and has a humble heart, humble servant attitude, and is doing what a daughter-in-law should do in that culture, and helping the two widowed women are helping each other. Boaz knows the relationships. He is a wealthy man. He would know who's related to who, what kind of relationship Ruth is to him, and that what kind of relationship Elimelech and his sons were to him, and who was the kinsman redeemers, and who was in line and who was close, and he would know all those things. He would know the social structure, and he's on top of the game. And so he goes out, and when he finds out this is the Moabitess, he goes out and talks to her and says, don't go somewhere else. Don't go to somebody else's fields. He's already given instructions to his men, let her glean, and keep her safe. He's concerned about his workers. He's concerned about the people that are in his field, even the ones that aren't his people. So there was probably other gleaners there also. That would have been the way things were. But he gave special instructions that this one, yeah, y'all think of her as a foreigner, but, and he probably didn't have to say that. He was thinking it, yeah, she's blessing Naomi, and she's coming out here and doing hard work and being diligent, and she's worked hard from early till now, and she's only taken one rest break. Um, like a lot of societies, they recognize that very often the reason that poor were poor is they were lazy and didn't work hard. But here she's poor, but she's working hard, and he sees potential that she may, she will help Naomi and help her survive, and is going to be a blessing to Naomi. And he's got some responsibility to Naomi. Um, he knows Naomi. It's part of his social network, part of his clan, and he's going to have to support this widow. And here, this girl is working hard and in the field and not taking excessive breaks. And so he says, make sure she gets the water she needs. Um, you know, yeah, when she got hot, she went to the shelter and stayed. Don't molest her. And that was a man's world where basically other men kept men in line. But if a man could take advantage of a woman, they would have, as long as that woman was not connected to them, other men would ignore it. And so here's this foreigner in the field, and he's telling his men, hey, I'm going to be her protector. You protect her because you're employed by me. He's protecting her and consequently also protecting what she gleans. A dishonest farmer would have stolen grain from the gleaners and gone, well, that's my grain. I'm going to take a tax because they're in my field, kind of thing. Um, that was wrong. And he's protecting what she gleans. He's protecting her. He's telling his men to protect her, telling them, hey, make sure she's hydrated. She draw water for her too. He's treating her with a great deal of care, above and beyond what was socially expected. Gleaners weren't generally allowed to go and drink water from the water that the employees had pulled for the other employees. Um, let's face it, hauling water is hard, heavy work. The technology they had at the time to carry it around was pottery or stone jars. Very often the jar weighed as much or more than the water did. Um, you haul the empty to the well or to the stream or to the pond, you fill it up and you haul it back. And then, the water gets drank and you got to haul it back. And the person who got the water for everybody, that was a full-time job during harvest season to keep everybody hydrated. And you wanted people to stay hydrated so they didn't get heat exhausted, didn't slow down, and like any good operation, you encourage your people to stay hydrated and encourage them to stay fully functional. And Boaz was very concerned, but he was also concerned for Ruth the Moabite, that she stayed hydrated and she stayed efficient. And he would understand that a gleaner was a blessing to him, as well as the food that she gleaned being a blessing to herself and Naomi. And that therefore, it was in the long term in his interest for this person to stay safe. He may have also known some of the other people in the community and known that if Ruth the Moabitess went to somebody else's field, there may have been some people that had a reputation for sexually harassing um, the women that gleaned, or even worse, raping them. And he was, wanting to protect her and say, "Hey, I feel safe. I told my men, just stay here with my field." And the thing is, he's wealthy enough that he has enough of fields that he knows she can get enough for her and Naomi without leaving his fields. Um, this, so it's a good thing. Uh, he's being kind to her, but in turn, he's getting a benefit from her in that he probably knows he's going to have to support Naomi, whether it's from the harvest or from allowing the gleaning. And if he protects Naomi, protects Ruth, he therefore protects Naomi. And it will reduce the amount that he has to pull out of his harvest, um, as well as keeping his field clean. And so it's a win-win. Um, if she works hard enough, he knows that he may be able to hire her in the future. This is, a bunch of different things are going on. And this is, and then she's humble to him. She expresses gratitude. She appreciates it, and asks, "Why are you blessing me like that when I'm a foreigner? I don't even have the standing of one of his servant girls." The, the women that were in that field were employees, basically, and she didn't have the social standing. And he's blessing her by protecting her and allowing her to get water and use the facilities that he has for his workers, and he's protecting her stuff. And she's grateful for it and humble and appreciative and doesn't know why she's being treated so nice. Well, she doesn't understand the full social situation. She knows that the people of Moab would have been looked down on by Israelites, just as the people of Moab looked down on Israelites. She would have understood that dynamic. She would not have necessarily known that Boaz was a kinsman and a close relative of Naomi's, and might have to support Naomi and Ruth just because they're part of the clan. And she might not have realized that. Probably didn't. She probably didn't understand all that. But she's still being humble. Very often, those who would glean would be the professional beggars and the people like that in the community. And if you've ever interacted with that kind of person much, sometimes they can be very, very bold and pushy and push back and act like it's their right for you to have to give them money or have to give them grain in this case. And would be indignant if they came by and accidentally brushed a sheaf and, you fussed at them because they were making more grain to glean. And Naomi's not that way. She was humble. And this impressed Boaz. Verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So he's not just telling his men, protect her, treat her right. He's telling them, hey, if she goes by and bumps a sheaf and some falls off, don't fuss at her for, you know, causing mess that then she can glean and profit more from. But actually go out of your way to pick a couple of heads off and throw it on the ground in front of her so she has more to glean. He's impressed with her. He really likes what he sees here. And he's probably doing it at this point as an old man that's seeing the community-wide scale and knows that this is a hard worker, and she's blessing her mother-in-law, and she doesn't really have to that much because he knows that Naomi, being part of the clan, she's got a social standing as an older woman, that she's a widow. She will be supported by the community, and he will have to be one of those people that supports her, whether she has a man or not. And here, Ruth isn't depending upon that social network. She's going out and working hard to try to make it on her own without having to beg, without having to take the support from the community. And so he's trying to bless her and tell his men, make sure she has plenty to glean. Intentionally be sloppy in front of her so she can glean more. And he watched her. He gave her a meal's worth of grain. He offered her bread and the wine vinegar. That was for the harvesters, the luxury part of the meal. He offered her that. And then roasted grain. When the first grain was harvested, they didn't have, everybody was busy. They didn't have time to make bread. They didn't have time to, the bread that was there was made from last year's grain. It had been stored a year. It would have been prepared ahead. And by late in the harvest would be, a week or so old. The wine vinegar, of course, would be at least a year old, possibly 2 or more. And it was there to flavor the bread. If this was early in the barley harvest, it might be only a day or 2 or 3 old, the bread. But nobody had made bread since the harvest started. It was made beforehand, and it would last only so long, and then it would be eaten up or get so stale that it was not fit to eat. And part of the wine vinegar was to make this stale, not very good tasting bread go down better, and gave it some flavor, gave it a little softer. He's allowing that, and let's face it, the wine vinegar was expensive. Not even today, it's expensive, but you've made wine, and then it got too old, and you made vinegar out of it, and it was a way of continuing to recycle and avoid wasting what you had. And they made good use of it to, flavor things and things like that. And so he's a wealthy man to feed that to his workers. He's being generous to them, being nice to them. But as soon as some grain got harvested, it was easy to roast it, to parch it, and cook that fresh grain so that it was then edible and chewable and not too hard to eat. They would very often, the first little bit of the harvest, the grain was a little bit too green still to last long, but that slightly green grain, while it wasn't quite ripe enough to dry right to grind and make flour, being a slightly wetter, if you put it on a hot griddle or a hot stone and shook it around, it would kind of puff up a little bit. Not not like popcorn does. You do that with popcorn, and you know it gets so hot and poof, and this little bitty grain turns into this big puffy thing. Parched grain is puffier than the grain. It kind of puffs up, but it say doubles in size. Popcorn can be 10, 20, 50 times as big as the kernel started with. We're all familiar with it. Um, Parching grain, um, it'll be about twice the size it was to start with. And yeah, it'll get slightly bigger if it's wetter and the slightly less large if it's drier. Um, when they started getting late enough in the harvest that the grain had dried well and it would keep well, it wouldn't parch well. When you did that, though, you could parch it and it would dry the grain out and it would make it so that when you chewed it, it fell apart into powder fine easier and it wasn't as hard to chew. But the fresh grain, the beginning of the harvest grain, it was still just almost too green to pick. Still more water in it for good that wouldn't keep well. When you parched it, it would puff up and make it even easier to eat, but it was also fast to cook. With the proper fire, 15 minutes, you could parch enough grain to feed the whole crew, and everybody could do it, and it would use up the grain that wouldn't keep. So it was a common meal to eat while you were harvesting. The parched grain is easier to chew. If it was moist to start with, too moist to store well, it would puff up more, but easier to chew. By later in the harvest, when it got harder, it would still dry and crackle and kind of toast, and the toasted grain had a good flavor, and it made it easier to chew. And in the length of time it would take somebody to grind the grain, they could have built the fire, roasted the grain, and passed it out to everybody. And the thing is, it also kept well. Your cooks could, as soon as they got enough to feed everybody all day, cook one batch, put it in the right kind of container, and when it's mealtime, you serve them, and what's left over gets to sit there, and the next meal you serve again. Somebody gets hungry in the middle of the afternoon, they can come by and grab a snack, and nobody has to mess with it. And the thing is, once it's parched, it's not going to attract insects, it's not going to attract vermin as bad as fresh grain will. So they don't have to protect it a whole lot. Basically, all they got to do is keep big things like birds and rats out of it. That's fairly easy. A stone jar, lid on it, you're done. You don't have to guard it. It's just there. And, somebody gets hungry, they go over and grab a handful and go. Well, Boaz gave her what he considered a meal's worth for her. She ate her fill, what she thought was enough for her. She had some left over, and she saved it. She was frugal. She recognized the gift that this is food, and she was appreciative of it. She may have been thinking, Naomi, hey, I can take this home to her, and I don't have to cook supper. Naomi can eat. We don't know the full thought process. That didn't get recorded, but he could see the behaviors that she ate. She ate enough, and then she's frugal. She saved it, and kept up with it, and she was not wasteful. Again, Boaz is impressed. And so that's why he gives these instructions to his men. Verse 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. When she threshed the barley she had gathered, it amounted to about an ephah. Now, an ephah is about, well, about 3/5 of a bushel, if you know what that is. I mean, that it's call it 5 gallons, roughly. This is not a trivial amount of grain. Uh, for one day's work, picking up one grain at a time, she's got and this is after she threshed it. So there's a lot of chaff that goes away. I mean, probably half the volume is chaff, inedible stuff. Um, she's picked up that much and brought home, and she gleaned until evening, then had to walk back to wherever she lived with Naomi, and then she had to thresh. And she did all that before she went to bed, and she had an ephah of grain. Uh, you know, a cup of, basically a half of a cup of grain is a meal's worth of grain. So a cup and a half a day for her, and a cup and a half or three, call it 3 cups a day. Um, she has a lot of food there, enough for her and Naomi to survive on for months after one day's work. And the harvest season is, not just a few days long. It's depending upon what part of the country, barley harvest could be 2 to 4 weeks. Likewise, the wheat harvest and etc. The grape gleaning, the grape harvest. You know, so they were fixing to be in this pattern where for about 3 months they were going to be harvesting some sort of produce, essentially all the time. And in one day, she's got enough for several months worth of food for the two of them, if they're frugal with it. She worked hard, picking up individual grains. That's a lot of work. Now, she may have been benefited because the men around her may have gone, yeah, we want to impress Boaz, and he seems to like this one, so pick a head off and throw it in front of her so that she has more to glean. They may have also recognized, like Boaz, that, if Ruth didn't glean enough, they were going to have to support her and Naomi later in the year. And it may be cheaper for them to, let her glean it and pick it up and thresh it than them. A fairly egalitarian society, even the workers would have been profited by this. Boaz, was wealthy, controlled a lot of land, planted a lot of grain, harvested a lot of grain, but he paid his workers well, and so they would have been fairly well off. This was not a society where there was a great wealth discrepancy between the lowest paid worker and the most wealthy. So, Boaz being wealthy, his harvesters would have been wealthy comparatively, and they may have, also been like, yeah, we're going to support her. Boaz has given us permission, we're going to do it. But even that, she worked hard to get that much. So, verse 18. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. In other words, she did have leftover parched grain, and she brought it to Naomi and gave her, the meal. And here's what I have left. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Um, Naomi knows the social connections. She understands that Ruth was working in the field of a man who could um, do the service of marrying the widow. Um, and that he has indeed blessed Ruth and the work and gave her plenty to eat and enough that Ruth could then give to Naomi. That Naomi probably knew how much was typical to glean for a day. And I kind of doubt an ephah of grain gleaning is typical. I've not done any gleaning. Closest I've ever done is like pick blackberries or pick up pecans. And let's face it, those are both bigger than grains of barley. And I've picked 5 gallons of blackberries in a day. I've picked up 5 gallons of pecans in a day. It's not that hard. You end up with, even if you stoop and pick up each one, it's pretty easy. But it's still a lot of work. And here she's come in with this huge amount of grain and for gleaning. And Naomi's impressed, and she knows that somebody showed Ruth kindness and wasn't cheating her and may have been actually helping her, like Boaz told his men, don't embarrass her if she accidentally uh, uh, picks among the sheep. That was probably a fairly common, thing for gleaners to do. Is like, I'm tired of picking up grains one at a time. Look around, nobody's saying, "I just grab a handful off this sheaf and stuff it in." She did that. Don't embarrass her. Well, there's no indication Ruth did that. And instead, she does the work the hard way and still gets a bunch. Probably indicative that the men were also pitching some grain her way in front of where she was gleaning so that she had plenty to glean. But after she's threshed it, after she's winnowed it, she has that much left. Naomi's impressed. She knows she's worked hard. She knows she worked in the field of somebody that treated her kindly, didn't harass her. And when she finds out it's Boaz, Naomi knows, hey, this is one of our kinsman redeemers. Now, a little bit about that term. The Levirate practice, when you find it in Genesis the first time, the practice was if an older brother died without children, the widow would then marry a younger brother, the next younger brother in line, and be his wife, and the first child would be named after the older brother as his heir and get his inheritance. And then any other children would be that second brother's wife, and so on. And originally it was done only among the brothers. And Moses, when he gave the Mosaic law, basically said that and gave it as command, you are to do this, and you are to maintain the name of the brother. in Genesis, when it's done, it was just kind of a custom, but not required. And if the younger brother didn't want to, he could choose to go, well, she can be a servant in my house and will support my servants, but I'm not necessarily going to give her children. Now, that was not in his economic interest, because the more people in the family, the more labor you had, and children were viewed as a good thing, and having your sister-in-law bear you children would be a good thing, because that gave you more people in your household to work and get more work done. And um, this is besides you automatically getting another wife, another hand in the household, um, somebody else to have sex with, etc. Um, it's kind of rare that the Levirate responsibility was not accepted by the younger brother in the times of Genesis, but it could happen. Um, Moses made the law, you must do it. Uh, it's not the first place in the Middle East that made it a law that it must happen. Other codes that are recorded have stated that before Moses. But he goes along with that. That's not out of line. Well, by the time we get to Boaz, it's not just the brothers. They've accepted that this is a clan, and if there's not a younger brother, that, or for some reason the younger brother is too young to get married, then there can be further relations away that then have responsibility to care for this widow and take her in, have her as a wife, and the first child would be the older brothers or the cousins or whatever. And they had established this hierarchy of, if it's not going to be a brother that fulfills this need for women to have a man, who's in line? And it was based on blood relations. Now, we don't have any documentation from Boaz's time. Actually, the oldest documentation we have of what the laws were actually written down by the rabbis in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity, and that's where we get a lot of the recording. But they had this process to determine, it goes first to brothers, and then it goes to uncles, and then it goes to the uncles' children, in other words, to the cousins, and then, et cetera, second cousins, and on and on and on. And you kept the widow in the clan, was the basic idea. And they understood there could be good legal reasons why somebody didn't want to marry this widow. If you don't get along with her, or, like we're fixing to find out later, a closer kinsman that could redeem, it would endanger his inheritance, and we'll get to how that could happen when we get there. They could, opt out, and particularly if there was another kinsman redeemer that was further away, but interested. There was a delicate art of negotiating that, just like any marriage proposal. Because in that day and time, a marriage proposal was not just a love interest or a sexual interest, it was also an economic interest. You were making a business deal with the other part of the clan, or the other clan, or whatever. And so, relationships to be done there. And so, Boaz is going to have to deal with all that. Well, Naomi knows this, and knows he's one of the people that could redeem us. And Naomi's not saying at this point that could redeem you, Ruth. Boaz could have married Naomi. Um, it was not out of line um, for him to have married Naomi. There will be children there, probably. The indication is she's, um, past the childbearing age, but there could still be economic need. That would be one way to support this widow is, well, marry her, and she's a wife, and you've got to support your wives. And, uh, you know, being an older man, marrying an older woman, nobody would have thought anything about it. Okay, he's not going to have children, and he knows that, but, um, you know, nobody has to worry about, is Naomi going to be supported? Um, and anybody associated with Naomi would therefore be part of the household. Well, so that's what Naomi is seeing and recognizing that Boaz is treating Ruth nice because he's a kinsman redeemer. She probably knows he's got responsibility to support Naomi and Ruth, and he's doing so by letting her clean and keeping her safe. So verse 21. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it would be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. Now, English translators have been nice to that translation. The word that is actually used in the Hebrew is one of the many forms of rape. Sexual harassment would be a better way to actually interpret the word. It very often is termed rape. It basically knowingly saying, you'll be fondled in somebody else's field. You're going to be safe with him and safe with his men. Stay with him. And she's being blunt. She's not beating around the bush. She's saying, stay with him because you're going to be safe with him in somebody else's field. You know, you're going to be molested and felt up, and nothing you can do about it. Stay with him and you're safe. And I'm sure Ruth understood those words and knew what they meant. She was convinced. It didn't take a lot to convince Ruth, yeah, I'm going to do that. Verse 23, so Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley harvest and wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So she spends the rest of the harvest season in Boaz's field, getting to know his servant girls and gleaning with them and living with her mother-in-law. They get to know her. She gets to know them. They begin to get integrated in the rest of the clan. And the social network is supporting Naomi and Ruth. And they're working hard to fit in and to work with it. And Naomi and Ruth are protected and they're safe. And Ruth is safe. And Boaz sees Ruth and how hard she works. He's probably not in the field with her every day. He's probably just walks through and checks on things and goes on. He has other business to do. Let's face it, he's an important man in this society. Kind of jump ahead. Something Oscar mentioned in his sermon when he talked about the lineage of Jesus the other week, that Boaz was the son of Rahab. Rahab, the Jews called her harlot, the prostitute. She was a hostile owner. But in Canaanite culture, um, being a woman hostel owner meant that, yeah, some of the money you picked up was catching a little sex on the side for cash. Um, in that society, that was an honorable profession. Um, and it wasn't just sex, but so therefore you weren't just a prostitute. But the Jews would have seen it that way. Um, well, she was allowed to marry into Jewish society. Boaz is her son. Even if he's the last born son, he's got to be an old man at this point in time. It's been a long time since the invasion because it's only 4 generations from here to David. Um, he's an old man. We're at least halfway through the period of the judges here. So he has had a lot of time to acquire wealth, to acquire prestige, to work with his clan, to become prosperous, to become an important man. He is watching. He's working for the benefit of the tribe, for the clan. Um, yeah, he's profiting himself, but he didn't get to be wealthy by being foolish and being silly and by being stupid, by taking risk. And he recognizes something in Ruth. And he knows he's going to have to support Naomi and Ruth. And he's doing so in a socially acceptable manner, in a moral and ethical manner. And he also is not prejudiced just because she's a Moabitess. Let's face it, he's half Canaanite, and he knows it. His mother had a reputation of being a prostitute. She may have been the most moral woman in Israel that during her time. He may have known how moral she was, but she has this reputation, and it's going to precede her. And let's face it, we still today call her the harlot. She still has that reputation. It would have been that way then. And he knows that he's been accepted. He's a big man in society, but that he can show that kind of kindness and that kind of love and that kind of acceptance to Ruth. He can extend that kind of mercy and grace to her, and he does so. This is part of the redemptive history of who Ruth is. That the law said she should be excluded from the community for 10 generations. She's accepted within months, not just years, not generations. Before the first harvest is over, she's being accepted in the community. And that's actually the way God wants us to be. Yes, the reason to be excluding them is they will be drawing you away to worship other gods. Wait, she's worshiping Yahweh. She is a Yahweh worshiper. And she's a hard worker, and she's humble, and he's accepting her. Lord Jesus, help us to be the kind of people that love that way, that serve others, and despite the flaws in their life, we accept them for who they are and extend grace and mercy to them when it's appropriate. Have us to be wise in how we do so, that we don't waste our substance giving to people who aren't humble and aren't gracious and grateful for it. But also, Lord, help us to be wise in finding who to help and how to help, like Boaz was. Lord, help us to be the kind of men and women that Boaz was, that he was wise and he was empathetic and kind and protective. Help us to be the kind of people that Ruth was, hardworking and humble. Lord, we ask that as a community, we be that kind of people, that we help each other, serve each other, that we are people of love. Help us be accepting of other people that have flaws, because we have flaws too. You've forgiven us much. Help us to forgive others and help them along, that we would tell them about your great love and your great forgiveness of our sin, and that they too can have it, and that we'll continue to bless them as they mature. In your gracious name, Lord. Amen. I hope to see you Wednesday. I hope to see you tomorrow at church. If I don't see you at church and I don't see you Wednesday, I'll see you here next week on YouTube. Have a blessed week.